This episode is sponsored by Volunteero, the volunteering management platform that helps you spend less time lost in spreadsheets and drowning in emails and more time developing your volunteering program and delivering impact. Whether you're coordinating 20 volunteers or 20,000 volunteers, Volunteero makes it simple to onboard, train, deploy, communicate, and report all in one easy-to-use platform. Today's episode of the Time for Impact podcast is proudly sponsored by Investing in Volunteers, the UK's quality standard for good practice in volunteer management. Check out more of their information updated regular on their LinkedIn page, and stay tuned to hear more about how IIV helps organisations create great volunteer experiences later in the show. Hello everyone, and welcome to yet another edition of the Time for Impact podcast. As always, we're trying to bring you some enlightened thinking from our guests around volunteering and volunteering innovation. And we try to bring you the big organisations that you may have heard of and some of the very small organisations that you may less likely have heard of. It doesn't matter to us because what we're interested in is the learning and the innovation. And I think we can learn from both. I think it's fair to say that today we have one of the larger organisations represented. We have Ollie Arthur from the RNLI, the Royal National Lifeboat Institute. For those of you who are outside the UK, the RNLI is pretty much as big a household name as you can get in charity, I would say, especially if you live by the coast. But actually, even if you live right in the centre of the UK, as I do, miles away from the sea, it's still a very well-known and well-respected and actually well-supported charity across the UK. Ollie's here, of course, as always, to talk about volunteering in that organisation. I should say that my co-host Matt Cobble is not with us this evening. Matt is in London and unable to get his train back on time to join this conversation, and I'm sure he's very sorry to be missing the conversation. But I am here, and Ollie is here, and I suggest we get on with the podcast. So, Ollie, welcome to the Time for Impact podcast.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be here. I've listened for many months now, so to be here is a great opportunity. So thank you for inviting me.
Great. It's always good to know that people are listening to the podcast. I know they are, but it's always nice to speak to somebody who is anyway. So why don't you start by telling us your journey into the world of volunteering, and then perhaps segue into telling people about the RNLI, especially knowing those who are perhaps international listeners who may know a little less about the charity.
Sure. I think like many people, I ended up in the voluntary sector by mistake, by accident really. So not really knowing what to do at a young age, I decided to take a year out, a gap year before going to university, and looked at the opportunities available. And the Prince's Trust were recruiting for a training administrator to support volunteers on courses that were learning to start their own businesses. So in fact, it was the training courses for young people that were starting their businesses supported by volunteer mentors. So that's my first exposure to, I suppose, professional volunteering, if you like. Before that, I volunteered myself as a young person for the Scouts. So I guess giving back, volunteering was always instilled in to me from a very, very young age. So it seemed natural to, want to go and support an organisation that supports young people through the use of volunteers as well. And then, of course, that gap year became a gap decade. And I never actually got to university because obviously the Prince's Trust, being advocates for young people and supporting young people, actually saw some value in me and wanted to keep me and basically gave me the qualifications and experience I'd have got from going to university in the workplace, which was a great sort of leading entry into a professional career in volunteer management. So from there, I actually went and worked for the Scout Association professionally from the headquarters at Gilwell Park in London, and continued to volunteer there as well, and saw the organisation from a completely different light, supporting volunteer managers across the organisation to develop young people, open new opportunities, growth and development across the Scouts. And then after around 12 years, took the opportunity to move to the RNLI in a community manager type role. But fundamentally, the RNLI is like the Scouts in many respects. Instead of a Scout group, you've got a lifeboat station run by volunteers like a Scout group is, except we're not giving young people adventure and activities. Rescues are being carried out. But behind that, there's still people on the committee raising funds, engaging young people and everyone in water safety messaging and education. Quite similar in many respects. So it seemed a very natural step to fulfill that volunteer management role in a different environment. So I started in a sort of community manager type role, then moved into a volunteering advisory role, and have had a couple of roles since then. After 11 and a bit years, I've now ended up as volunteering development operations manager, so responsible for overseeing everything from policy and process through to how we engage corporates, utilise skills-based volunteering more effectively, and really have an oversight of volunteering development across the RNLI. The RNLI is a search and rescue and educational charity that supports not just rescuing, but importantly, water safety education delivery across the UK and Ireland, and internationally as well. So a small percentage of our funds is utilised to support drowning prevention activity internationally too, and often that gets overlooked, but an important part of what we do. So to make all that happen, we have a huge number of volunteers, in excess of 20,000 volunteers. The smallest part of that really is our operational volunteers who undertake rescues from our lifeboat stations. As you can imagine, to launch and recover a lifeboat takes a crew to do that, as well as be on board as well. And then we need to raise the funds. So we have a huge number of engagement volunteers who fundraise through all the traditional type of fundraising activity, plus shops, retail, events. And then our education volunteers who try and stop people getting into danger in the first place. So water safety education is a really important part of what we do. And engaging the public in our visitor centres, our heritage, all those different aspects of the organisation too. So a really diverse range of opportunities and people that volunteer at the RNLI. And I think that's what keeps it really interesting and engaging, having such a variety of different people doing different things. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. And
yeah, and I looked on the website and you mentioned some of these numbers: 23,000 volunteers, of which I'm sure this number must be updated on the website daily. 7,828 crew and shore personnel, 140 lifeguards, and 14,000 community fundraisers. So it's a big army of community fundraisers. But what really comes through, I suppose, one of the many things that comes through, as you just alluded to, is just a sheer range of opportunities. Some of which you'd expect community fundraisers, I think, in organisations like RNLI, but actually some quite unique skills-based volunteering. And one of the ones you talked to me about when we chatted a few months ago was a sort of mediator role, which I have to say, I don't think I've come across anywhere else in the volunteering world. Now, there'll be people commented now to say, oh, no, we do that. But why don't you tell us about your volunteer mediators and more broadly, how you bring sort of skills-based or more unusual volunteering roles into the organisation?
Definitely. And I'd love to hear if there are people out there that do have volunteer mediators, because I haven't found any yet. And whilst I was looking at developing this role, that was certainly one of the things I was looking for. And of the many roles we have developed at the RNLI, this one has certainly sparked some interest, because as well as yourself, I've had half a dozen other volunteering professionals get in touch to ask more about how we've carried out this recruitment and devised this role. And, you know, as you say, we do have a wide range of roles at the RNLI, but I think from the public's point of view and perception, they probably see the RNLI as volunteers who go and rescue people and perhaps shake a bucket or not. And that's probably the limit of where people kind of see how to volunteer. You know, I think we've been quite good at promoting the different ways that people can get involved at the RNLI. But there's still so many ways that we could offer those opportunities, particularly in those non-traditional skills-based roles. So over the last few years, and well beyond that, you know, we've created opportunities for people to come and give their skills and experiences in different ways. But part of my challenge has been to formalise that and have a process to do that effectively, and almost look at volunteering as part of our workforce planning to say, actually, okay, we need some additional resource here. How could we do that differently? Could we do that with the skills and experience a volunteer could bring to our team or department? So one of the questions I ask people is, what can't you achieve now with your existing resource that you could if you had the skills and experience a volunteer can bring? And that could be across any team, whether that's our engineering department, whether it's, you know, building a lifeboat in our factory, or doing calculations in the accounts team. It doesn't matter where, there's always somewhere that a volunteer can lend their experience and skills. And one of the areas that any organisation faces, including us, with so many volunteers from diverse backgrounds, is with volunteer problem solving. And, you know, that can take up quite a bit of time for our volunteer managers to resolve issues.
When you say problem solving, just for anybody listening, that's a euphemism for when things go wrong or when there's complaints.
Yeah, so essentially the volunteer equivalent of the grievance and disciplinary policy in the staff space is what we call our volunteer problem solving policy. So our issue resolutions process, essentially. To do that effectively, we do need managers to take accountability and work through that process to see issues resolved effectively. However, it is time consuming, and we want to avoid issues escalating to the more formal processes in the first place. And often the reason they do escalate is because we haven't been able to nip it in the bud, understand the issue at an early stage. And we could probably do that better by offering facilitated conversations and mediation between volunteers to help them see a way forward between themselves and resolve their own issue before it does escalate to the more formal stages. Mediation has been in the RNLI for many years, and it was introduced, you know, nearly 20 years ago, particularly in the staff team. We went through a period of upskilling some managers and training them through ACAS to mediate across the RNLI for volunteers and staff. However, you know, we got to a point where we could probably increase that number, because through natural people, you know, leaving, moving on, what have you, the number did decrease. And I thought there must be people out there that have got mediation skills that could come and support us with their experience to help our volunteers get through an issue. So I sat down with one of our existing volunteers, who's an operational volunteer but has a background in arbitration and mediation. I spoke to our HR business partner responsible for employee mediation. And between us, we came up with a role description for what a mediator would look like at the RNLI, and then set about recruiting people that would meet the responsibilities of that role. And we were quite clear that we were going to recruit people that were trained and accredited in mediation. We didn't want to go down the route of training people for a number of reasons, including budgets and time and resource. But we want people to come to us and say, yeah, this is how I can support you with mediation. These are the skills and experiences that I have. So we worked with some of the mediation bodies within the UK, used different networks of professionals that we had contacts with, and ended up with 21 people applying to be a mediator, over 2 regions that we were piloting the scheme in. So in the southwest and Wales and West Isle of Man regions, we decided to start a pilot of having volunteer mediators in place. So that's where the 21 people applied from. And out of those 21, we were able to select 4, 2 per region, to be mediators. And they come from a variety of backgrounds. We have a couple that are HR professionals that are very experienced in workplace mediation. We have a recently retired solicitor who's coming from an international law firm who has a background in collaboration and amalgamation of corporates. And then we have someone who's got many years of experience of running a business but has a background in neurodiversity and supporting people with those backgrounds, which is really important. So the 4 of them do bring a real mix of different experiences and skills, but all have that background and accreditation in mediation. So they have now been inducted into the RNLI, and we've had our first call for mediation from a volunteer fairly recently. So this is a pilot. We're going to carry on for 3, then 6 months and review how it's going. And assuming the pilot is successful, we'll then roll out mediation across the remaining 4 regions.
I guess there's a question of scale as well, and you're one of the organisations that probably got enough scale to be able to do this. Hopefully, in most of our organisations, there are only so many times that we need to draw upon a mediator. Hopefully, if the culture's right and the organisation's going well. So I guess what you don't want is a big team of trained mediators sitting around with nothing to do. So I'd be interested, but you talked about regions there. Maybe the pilots, one of the things that may come out is that actually you can expand the geography, but don't need to expand the number of people. They can do online mediation or something. And, I guess it's going to be a bit of a match in the number of cases that need mediating with the number of mediators to some degree as well.
That's right. I mean, with the mediators we had previously, who were predominantly staff members with full-time day jobs that were volunteering to mediate on top of their day jobs, there was a challenge with matching mediators to locations because we cover the whole of the UK and Ireland, as you pointed out earlier, not just coastal areas, but inland as well. The challenge was getting people in the right place at the right time without a delay, because, although mediation online, has its place and certainly did through the lockdowns, we do really want to try and make that a face-to-face interactive session. So definitely face-to-face mediation is our preferred method, and achieving that is fairly difficult with a small number of people, hence trying to have at least 2 per region if we move this forward. So you're quite right, though. The challenge is keeping them occupied and engaged if there isn't a mediation case forthcoming, because, as you say, with good management, we don't want to see many mediation cases. Inevitably, with so many volunteers, there will be cases that come up.
And I wonder I'm just thinking that some of our listeners from small organisations may be thinking, well, that's all well and good, but I wouldn't have enough cases to need a mediator. But, I think there's scope for coalitions here. There's scope for charities working together to build up a pool of mediators who work across several charities. I was wondering, during my professional life as a director of volunteering, a head of volunteering and so on, that I've never come across this before. And I've always had to pay somebody. I think occasionally I've managed to bring in a pro bono mediator sort of off the cuff, but I've not had a bank of mediators, volunteers trained up. But actually, it seems such an obvious thing to do. People come to us with those skills, those experiences. There may already be some already involved in our charities. I don't know if yours were volunteering for other organisations or yours, but there may even be some lived experience in the organisation. So I'd be very interested to see if there could be some sort of coalitions charities. But I mean, all
Absolutely.
credit to RNLI for allowing, first of all, for you, Ollie, and the team for thinking outside the box and bringing in such roles. And I know there's others you'll tell us about. But also there's something about the culture of an organisation that allows that to happen. Because I can think of many organisations who would say, I'm not sure about having, when they need to be staff or when they need to be consultants or because we need to have some control over the quality. But of course, the quality of a volunteer mediator is just as good as a paid mediator.
Absolutely.
But I think there is something culturally about, you mentioned to us, maybe you'll tell us more, that, you go around and talk to all the departments, finance department and other departments and say, I imagine ICT, and say, how can volunteers get involved? I know in a lot of organisations, there'll be quite a lot of resistance to the idea of volunteers getting involved in their team. But it sounds like you, at least from the top, possibly from within, you've got a culture in the organisation that allows that conversation to develop new ways for people to volunteer.
Certainly, it is something that is growing and will continue to grow. And I think utilising those managers and leaders that have benefited from volunteers has been the key so far. Volunteers Week this year, we kind of changed the direction of it, really. And of course, there was a focus on thanking our volunteers. But for the RNLI, it was looking at how we can do volunteering a bit differently. So it was as much as an internal campaign to our managers and staff as it was to our volunteers. And part of that was engaging managers to look at volunteering differently. So we were able to utilise a manager from our retail marketing team and a manager from our occupational health team who have benefited from volunteers for the first time in their teams, to tell the rest of the organisation about what that's meant for them, what they've been able to achieve differently, additionally to what they've been able to achieve with a purely staff team previously. I also had their volunteers along to give the message from them to say what have they benefited from being part of that team as a volunteer. So hearing both sides of the equation talking enthusiastically about the benefits of having volunteers in their team and what they got from it was, I think, inspiring for others to see. So following some of those lunch and learn sessions and case studies and videos that we put out this year, there's been an increase in interest from different teams. There's one that I'm working with at the moment in IT, actually, in our digital team, around using digital volunteer champions, essentially, to offer peer-led first-line support for those people that struggle with technology and digital applications, essentially. So there's a huge number of stakeholders involved in this at the moment because, it involves everyone from IT, systems support, digital, etc., to all agree and come together on how such a role could be rolled out. But that's the bit I like. That's the challenge, isn't it? We can all see the benefit of a new volunteer role. How do we actually make it work? We can work out budgets and line management responsibilities and resources. We can sort that. Let's just agree what we want to achieve, what we think a volunteer can add, and how can we make it work and happen. And there shouldn't be anything that's insurmountable, really. So I guess my job really is trying to unpick all the locks to make it happen and all tied together and see if we can make a difference.
But often those challenges, the project management tasks, the stages you go through, the outcomes, the outputs that you want, the products that you want to produce are one thing, but often it's the hearts and minds, which is the most difficult one, and the one which is never really put together very well in a project plan or very often. But it sounds to me that you've got the hearts and minds bit cracked. It sounds to me you've got a staff team that intrinsically understand the value of volunteers and that volunteers can play a wide range in role. I suppose, does that come from the very fact that your volunteers are saving lives at sea and doing the most technical and difficult jobs as well? So it's obvious that we should trust our volunteers.
I think so. We can turn anyone that's got the enthusiasm and commitment into a volunteer who can operate a £2.5 million lifeboat and be trusted with the keys to a lifeboat station. If we can ask a volunteer to do that, surely we can ask a volunteer to do anything, essentially. And they pretty much do at the RNLI. And I think most of the staff do get that. And I think it starts from day one. So volunteering is a key part of staff induction at the RNLI. So the volunteering team has input on all new starters inductions to make sure they really understand volunteering at the RNLI and that they're not just working at any other organisation or business, that this is a charity that is only here because volunteers are giving up their time to meet our objectives. Doesn't matter whether you're a forklift driver in the warehouse, finance assistant, an IT technician, whatever job you do impacts a volunteer somewhere. And that's the message that we try and hit home. So I think people generally do accept and admire that volunteers can make a difference anywhere, but perhaps haven't seen previously how volunteers could help them in their team, because it's just not been an area that volunteers have traditionally volunteered. So the more that we have skills-based volunteering roles cropping up in different departments and teams across the organisation, more people will see that happening and will start to ask and are asking, well, how do we get some of this? How do we have a volunteer in our team? And that's the progression that we're seeing. As I say, the next step is really embedding that into workforce planning with our HR business partners, etc., and just getting managers to think a bit differently about how they can introduce skills and experience into teams or ways of working. So yeah, as I said before, it's about looking at what people would like to achieve but can't with the resources they currently have, but could with the experience and skills that a volunteer could bring. I think that's what normally gets people a bit inspired and excited by having volunteers in their team, definitely. And it's a great development opportunity as well, perhaps for some people that haven't, been line managing staff previously. It's a great opportunity to be able to do that potentially for some people. To get a bit of a team around them to help them achieve something. So yeah, it's definitely getting traction.
Let me ask you something I don't think we've discussed on the podcast before, but I think your organisation is a good one to ask the question of. We all know, if we look at Time Well Spent survey over here in the UK, which gave us a good insight into what volunteers are looking for from their experience. If we look at the various surveys in our various nations over here, the household surveys and what volunteers expect, we look at the vision for volunteering in the UK. One common theme is about empowering and giving agency to volunteers and giving them some control and to innovate around what their volunteering looks and feels like, which is great, and we talk about that quite a lot on the podcast. But some of your volunteers, and I'm probably thinking about those who are driving the £2.5 million boats, they clearly have, I imagine, a good safety protocol, some rule books, some risk assessments.
Sure.
A lot of paperwork to deal with. All the things that we're, I suppose, inherently told volunteers don't like are kind of necessary evils of running a lifeboat or saving people through life saving at sea, lifeguards as well. How do you manage that sort of dichotomy such that you obviously have to make sure people are safe? That's your primary concern. That's the whole reason you exist as a charity. But at the same time, you want to give empowerment and agency, flexibility and trust to your volunteers. How do you grapple with that?
I mean, flexibility for operational volunteers is always a tricky one because, as you've alluded to, there is a required amount of training and service required to, retain your competencies and to meet certain standards. Flexible volunteering is limited within the operational space, but there are ways that we can ensure that people have enough time away from volunteering, like shift systems and what have you. But essentially, as a lifesaver, someone is committing to responding to that pager and getting to the lifeboat station and supporting that rescue, that mission to take place. And there is a lot of training involved, a lot of keeping their skills honed, but I think it's about having that commitment and expectation set out at the start through the recruitment process. So making sure we have a really robust selection process for both parties to ensure that we're selecting the right people for the right roles in the first place. And that is not always going to work out, as it does in many organisations, but we have a 12-month probation process for operational volunteers to get to a certain level of competency. And we can see through that 12-month period whether they're the right volunteer for us, and likewise whether we're the right organisation for them. But yes, there is a large amount of safety and protocol, as you said, but I think the use of technology is helping with that as well. Apps and systems to monitor progress, location, those sorts of things. Making sure we have the required number of training slots available so people can progress within their required timescales, that type of thing. So yes, there are challenges, but I think if someone's got a real expectation of what's required and they're open to that, they work with us to meet the needs of the role. And for those that can't, or we haven't met the expectations, or there's a mismatch of motivation, then let's try and find something else for those people to do in a different type of role, rather than be an operational volunteer, for example. So yeah, with responsibility comes, the trust. It's one of our key values, to be trusted. It goes both ways. So I've spoken to peers from other organisations, some large national organisations, and some of the sort of 3 or 5 things they wouldn't let a volunteer do, we do, because we have a different culture, a different outlook, I guess. As I said earlier, volunteers have responsibility for very expensive equipment. They have the keys to very expensive property. They're responsible for each other's lives, essentially, the people they're volunteering with.
So not much more responsibility than that.
Exactly. And their families and everything else. So I think there is that values-based relationship that our volunteers have with the organisation, and vice versa.
Presumably, you can double down on some of the other benefits of volunteering, though. So the sense of belonging must be really strong. I imagine there's a good social feeling, good social atmosphere.
Yeah.
I imagine it also could be quite good fun in lots of places.
Right. Yeah.
There's no hiding away from the impact of the work that the volunteers do, certainly in those frontline roles. And there's opportunities for learning new skills and development. So I can see that there's lots of real good positives that do maybe compensate where you have to do things a certain way. And I'm sure people understand why.
Absolutely. I think for our non-operational volunteers, which is the majority, and that's the point that we always make. You said the stats at the start, but a smaller percentage of our volunteers are operational frontline volunteers. The majority are doing the engagement work, the fundraising, everything else. And there's a large onus on those fundraisers as well, because it's often said that the most prominent, most crucial boat in the fleet is actually the tin one on the bar or the counter in the shop that people put their pennies or pounds in, because without those boats being filled with cash, we wouldn't have any lifeboats to go to sea. So our fundraisers are a really important part of our volunteer crew. And I think that is one of the key messages within the last 5 years. In fact, one of the legacies of our former chief exec is our one crew ethos, that doesn't matter what role you have within the RNLI, you are part of one crew. And, I think that does hit home with most people. I just have a different role to you and you and you, but we're all here to save lives at sea.
Yeah. As a volunteer manager, you're asked to wear many hats. No doubt your inbox is overflowing. You're using tools that don't speak to each other, and quite frankly, more time than you'd like is spent on admin and manual tasks.
Volunteero exists for this exact reason. Volunteero helps volunteer managers bring all aspects of volunteer management into one easy-to-use, flexible system that can be molded to your exact needs. It is so much more than a database that sends out emails. It is an all-encompassing platform that empowers your volunteers to do more.
We hear amazing feedback from their clients that include the likes of the RAF Museum, the Royal Voluntary Service, and Keach Hospice. So if you'd like to learn more, book a demo on their website, volunteero.org, or email them at hello@volunteero.org.
If volunteers power your organisation, here's something you'll want to hear. At Investing in Volunteers, we know great volunteering doesn't happen by accident. It happens when organisations commit to giving volunteers the very best experience, one that's safe, supportive, meaningful and genuinely impactful. That's why more than 1,000 organisations across the UK and Republic of Ireland have chosen Investing in Volunteers, the quality standard for good practice in volunteer management. Whether you're a CEO looking to build a stronger culture or a volunteer manager wanting to boost retention and engagement, working with your designated experienced assessor gives you a clear, practical framework whilst also upskilling your team. And the best bit is not about perfection. It's about learning, improving and showing your volunteers they truly matter. Earlier this year, Prostate Cancer UK achieved their 3rd award and said that going through the assessment has been a valuable and insightful experience, a great opportunity to reflect, learn and grow. So if volunteers are part of your vision, make Investing in Volunteers part of your strategy. Find out more and sign up for your free no obligation quote at investinginvolunteers.co.uk.
I notice on your website you also talk about quite low commitment volunteering, which I think is, again, it's natural to think of those stereotypical boat crew roles, but actually people can come along and give a very short period of time of volunteering for the RNLI, and they're still part of that crew.
Absolutely that. Yeah. Only last week we got together as a team to look at micro volunteering, one-off volunteering, low commitment volunteering. What does that mean for the RNLI, and how can we achieve that? And, if you go on the website now, there's a number of opportunities that people can click on and volunteer in a matter of minutes without a role description, without filling out a form, and giving us all their personal details. And that will increase and grow, as you well know, and all the listeners will know, about trends and commitment in volunteering. We have to adapt and change our approach, and have those opportunities for people to volunteer in a very low impact and low commitment way. So it'll be interesting to see how that does develop as time moves on, definitely.
You'd mentioned those plastic ships that you fill up with coins.
Yeah.
Distributing those to your local businesses and so on and collecting again is flexible. It's low commitment in terms of it doesn't take long. You can do it when you like. So you already have some of those roles, of course, in the organisation.
Absolutely.
And you involve young people in volunteering as well. I noticed the age starts at 13.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's quite a surprise for a number of people. We often ask people when they come on a volunteer managers workshop, what's the youngest age that you can volunteer at the RNLI? And normally people will say 18, then maybe 17 or 16, but you're right, actually it is at 13. Clearly, it will depend on the role and the type of activity being carried out, but we do have a range of options from 13, 16, 18. So yeah, a huge number of ways that young people can get involved. And we're also re-establishing our Duke of Edinburgh Award opportunities as well. So it was paused for a number of years because there was a mismatch between how students could operate previously to perhaps current safety standards and regulations. So we want to make sure young people get a really good experience and are inspired. So let's create a program that's suitable and representative of activity that young people can actually get involved with. So we've been piloting the DofE scheme at a number of lifeboat stations and shops across the UK, and that's expanding and rolling out as well. So after a period of pause, it's great to see young people getting involved in that way as well. So I think there's more we can do, and it's definitely a focus for the RNLI, how we engage younger people, but great to see activity happening with under 18s, definitely.
Yeah. Just for our international listeners, Duke of Edinburgh, DofE,
yes,
is a sort of youth volunteering scheme where people can give small amounts, reasonably small amounts of volunteering, but over several sessions to get gold, silver and bronze awards, if I remember rightly. So it's in lots of charities and community organisations, and you get like a badge for making each standards, and the schools and some of the youth groups particularly promote it. So it's a great way for young people to get the habit of volunteering, which is something we really like. And I guess that habit of volunteering is a sort of succession planning device potentially for the RNLI as well. You want, not necessarily for the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme, but through volunteering in general. Is your thinking that if you get young people involved in lifeboat cause early on, they'll carry on volunteering for you or for others around the sort of coastal communities going forward? Or is it just simply you're really glad to have them now?
Yeah, well, a bit of both, really. I think long term, we want to really inspire people to volunteer for the RNLI or anywhere, as you rightly point out. Just inspiring young people to volunteer is a great thing. But if they choose to volunteer with us, even better, of course. But there needs to be a cultural shift, really, because we can't expect volunteers to come and join the RNLI and stay for 30 years, 40 years, which has been the traditional stance. We need to accept that, younger people will come and volunteer and perhaps do 2 or 3 years and then go and try volunteering elsewhere and move on. But we need to adapt our processes, our policies and everything to reflect that, which is happening, and creating those shorter term opportunities, lower commitment opportunities for volunteering. But putting the time and the effort in to supporting volunteers is never going to be wasted, because we'll have inspired a supporter for life, hopefully. And when their life changes or circumstances change, hopefully they'll consider coming to volunteer for the RNLI again. Yeah. And with so many opportunities inland as well, if someone's interested in water activities and happen to live by the coast, great. But if they move inland to the city or wherever, there's opportunities there too. So that diverse range of opportunities to volunteer, I think, does hold us in good stead to, capture and retain people across wherever they choose to live and work. So yeah, I think there's still a lot of work to do on that sort of cultural shift, particularly for, certain aspects of what we deliver. But we'll get there, and we'll develop and create opportunities that does inspire and retain people long term, definitely.
Yeah, you're on the journey. That's a good thing.
Yes.
And I think it's kind of interesting because one obvious traditional way into that would have been to build a sort of cadet force, wouldn't it? Like, you've been to the Scouts and other organisations, and that is a model that could work. But there is something about, as you say, about recognising that the more transient and sporadic trends in volunteering, especially with young people, might mean that actually, introduced as small ways to get involved, and then they become kind of connected, have a sense of belonging in the community. It's not like they're trapped, but they have an affinity with the organisation and with the cause. And if
Absolutely.
You can do several of those, that gradually nurtures itself over time. And some of them will come back and volunteer a lot, and some will come back and volunteer occasionally. Many of them, I imagine, will support you with cash and other ways as they get older. So you're building a community that has a sort of an easy way for people to keep coming back and contributing, as opposed to a way of just sort of almost entrapping people into an organisation saying, please stay with us for life, which is a much harder sell.
That's right.
It works for some people too. Yeah, it's interesting.
Definitely. And I think the way charities will collaborate with each other moving forward to utilise volunteers differently will change. As we said earlier, with the volunteer mediators, imagine if they were volunteering across multiple charities. I think the way charities are going to meet their objectives moving forward is only going to be through collaboration, essentially. And there's some of that going on at the RNLI. Definitely, we work with amazing partners domestically and internationally, but that's going to become the norm eventually for all organisations, I think, in the future.
That's really interesting, Ollie, because you could make the argument. We had a conversation way back about a year ago with Michael Phillips at Crisis. I don't know if you listened to that episode, Ollie, but he was very much talking about Crisis being a homelessness charity.
Yeah.
Understanding that actually their role isn't necessarily to provide all the solutions to homelessness in every community. Sometimes it's about saying, well, sometimes we'll empower the local community and other community groups to find ways to make safety around the sea more effective. And that doesn't always have to be, I guess, through the RNLI, especially if you take your wider remit of saving lives as opposed to going out to sea. And empowering volunteers and other organisations and partnering with them could be a really interesting area of development, I guess.
Absolutely. And what does that look like from a volunteer management and relationship perspective? And I've sort of been drawn into some of those conversations and partnerships over the years. And you're absolutely right. We want to prevent people getting into trouble at sea, and in some cases preventing them getting into the water in the first place. So working with partner agencies that rely on volunteers to do that is, critical. It's the only way that we can meet our objectives. And a couple of examples of that are working with the Beachy Head chaplaincy service. For those listeners that aren't aware, Beachy Head, unfortunately, is a location associated with people wanting to end their life through suicide. And ultimately, if someone decides to enter the water from Beachy Head, the RNLI inevitably will be called to rescue or recover the casualty. But there's a volunteer base at Beachy Head, the Beachy Head chaplaincy, that are there to spot people who need support to stop them entering the water in the first place. So, working in partnership with them to stop casualties in the first place is a good example of that happening. Same in London. Our busiest lifeboat station of all the 237 stations is Tower Lifeboat Station on the River Thames. And we have a crew, a full-time staff crew supported by volunteers 24/7 on the water on the floating lifeboat station, operating a shift system there. And a large proportion of their activity is from people entering the water who intended to by, jumping from a bridge over the river. So there's another organisation that operates a bridge watch scheme. Again, it has trained counsellors that patrol the bridges looking for people in distress who can then go and have those conversations and intervene before the person enters the water. So working very closely with those organisations to prevent tragedy, really, and also working with waterside restaurants, eateries, the nighttime economy, to train their staff in how to rescue people, how to throw a life ring or a throw line into the water could be the difference between life and death for some people. So our water safety education volunteers and staff go and work with door staff, waiters, all sorts of people in the nighttime economy to train them as volunteer responders, essentially, who can pick up a throw line and rescue someone if needed. So absolutely, the way forward is going to be through collaboration and partnership, working for, I think, all organisations.
I think that's really interesting. And I'm sure a lot of people listening wouldn't know that, you've got an education team that does that kind of work and working in partnership with others. And I'm always interested in that. What is a volunteer? Yeah. There's volunteers who provide roles for us. There's sporadic volunteers and short-term volunteers that we discussed earlier on, the micro-volunteering.
Mm.
But actually what we're really talking about is people who have an affinity and a belief and an alignment with the cause that whatever we're behind and want to participate actively to do something about that. That, in my head, is a definition of volunteer. And some of those people won't see themselves as volunteers. They will be partners. Maybe they'll be people who've been saved at sea who are doing a
Yeah.
talk in the local community about what they learned, what their experience was.
Right.
There'll be crew members talking about their experience of either the RNLI or life at sea or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But all those people, just with that sort of form of telling stories, I guess, are incredibly powerful advocates for your mission and are giving their time. So in that sense, they're all volunteers in my head. Increasingly as volunteer managers, it's really interesting how we start to sort of gradually push the boundaries of what volunteering is and therefore what volunteer management is about. In fact, I don't even call it management, volunteer curating, convening, whatever the word is. It becomes a much wider thing. Surely that's what our job as a profession is to mobilize people who have an affinity with our cause to play a role, big or small, regular or occasional. That's what our job is, isn't it? And it's good to see some of that really happening at the RNLI.
Absolutely. And, going back to the volunteer mediators, why did they choose to come and mediate at the RNLI? I always love to ask that question of any volunteer. Why did you choose to come and volunteer at the RNLI? Whenever I speak to one, you get a whole range of answers, including many of the ones that you just quoted there. But for the mediators, I think there's two main reasons why they decided to mediate for the RNLI. One, there wasn't any volunteer opportunities anywhere else to mediate, but they wanted to experience mediation in a different environment to the one that they're used to. Secondly, they all had a connection to the sea or the coast or the RNLI somehow. And it's really interesting reading their applications and then having an informal chat with them to hear that they've all got some sort of connection to the sea or the RNLI. Whether their parents had been rescued, as in one case, and whether they visited RNLI stations as a child on beach holidays, or whether they're a sailor in their spare time, they've all got that affinity to the coast or the RNLI. And I guess that is why they will volunteer with us. And the whole conversation we had about collaboration and lending their skills and experience across a number of organisations. I guess all volunteers have those different motivators for volunteering, but I think theirs is clearly because of the RNLI and the cause. So it would be interesting to see if we offered those 4 mediators the opportunity to go and volunteer at another half a dozen organisations in the same capacity. Would they choose to? Would they be happy to? Or is it because of the connection to the cause and the RNLI?
I think the connections are really, really important. I think you'll probably find the answer is yes to both of those things because to contradict everything I've just said, in a sense, I don't know if you've heard the BBC Reef lectures, which have been running at the moment, run every Christmas time. Well worth listening at the moment. I forget the name of the historian, forgive me, who's doing this one. But it's very interesting. He talked a bit about the resistance against the Nazis in Holland and the research, and they asked people, what drove them to participate into, and obviously I imagine they're all motivated by the same cause there, but the thing that was the determining factor that determined whether somebody did join the resistance or didn't was that they were asked.
Oh, wow.
So it's, and I think there's probably a parallel there for volunteering. We do need to just ask people, but that doesn't mean that those individuals didn't buy into the resistance, or that anybody who we asked to get involved in the RNLI doesn't believe in saving lives at sea. I think they were given.
Yeah,
but it's easy to build people around those things. So. Anyway, Ollie, it's been lovely to chat to you.
Likewise.
It's been great to hear a bit more about the RNLI than perhaps we, especially us in the middle of the country here on a regular basis. And it's been really interesting to hear about some of the roles and activities that volunteers do that are perhaps less obvious, and how you are building a culture of really rethinking involvement in the RNLI. And I think that's fab. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to you, your colleagues, and especially to all those volunteers who are out there, either on land or at sea, playing their part in saving people's lives. It's greatly appreciated, I'm sure, by everybody, and long may it continue. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for the praise to our volunteers as well. I think, the RNLI is a bit of a institution in the UK and Ireland, and we've been around for over 200 years. And I think it is one of those organisations that can become perhaps a bit of a, it's always there, it'll always be there. But actually, it's only there because of our volunteers. So always nice to have some praise and thanks for those people that are keeping the service going. So thank you for that. And it's been really great to chat, Chris. Thank you.